you so much, Evis, for the amazing introduction. I'm so excited to get to talk specifically to this group. I've been talking to, a lot of different groups about the piece since it was published in September, but this is the first time I've actually gotten to speak to a group of Puerto Ricans about this work. And that's so exciting to me because when I was writing it, I was thinking of scholars like the scholars in this group specifically. There were so many concerns that I was seeing that we kind of aired in private. And the whole purpose of this piece was to try and get a lot of these ideas that I think all of us were talking about or thinking maybe about actually getting those out to the world. And so to me, this is really exciting to get to bring it back to this group and get to discuss this piece with you all. So thank you, Evis, for the invitation. I'm just so thrilled to talk to you all. So as Evis mentioned, my name is Danielle. I am at the University of Colorado Boulder. We also have a center that we just began this last summer called the Just Environments Lab. As Evis mentioned, the piece we're talking about today is extremely theoretical, but actually the majority of the work I've been doing on these topics are actually very practice-based, very community-based, not just in Puerto Rico, but also at the US-Mexico border. I do work in South Texas where they just experienced a number of rainstorms and hurricanes and massive flooding. And so I work in these two regions. And so we're working with these regions to think about how FEMA has been withholding systemically money from low-income communities, particularly low-income communities of color. So that's how a lot of these theories start to work on the ground, trying to understand how FEMA can reconceptualize certain pieces of their programs or individuals and households programs in particular to try and help low-income communities. So yeah, this is just a small portion of a much larger project. For today, what I wanted to do was just very quickly go over the piece. So first give a background. It feels like this first part might be a bit preaching to the choir as part of this group. But there's always this question of, why should you study Puerto Rico? Why does it matter? And so I always like to kind of put that to bed first before I jump into the meat of the content. And then I'll go through disaster colonialism. The idea kind of springs from multiple different places and kind of came to one sort of point in the article that we're talking about today, and then just some final thoughts that came out from the piece that could maybe spur some discussion afterwards. And so first starting with this idea of why Puerto Rico. And so I think most people here are familiar with where Puerto Rico is located in the Caribbean. And I think most of you all here know that it's in diaspora. And so I think as much as we're talking right now about the island, thinking about its connections to many different locations across the US, 3 million Puerto Ricans living on the island, but now we estimate somewhere like 5 million living outside of the island or the archipelago, so we're in a diaspora. Also, understanding this long history, centuries of colonization, first under the Spanish, stretching all the way back to the 15th century. Now, very contentious, but many people extending that idea of colonization and coloniality even under the US today. And this idea that Puerto Rico remains one of the oldest colonies in existence in the world. And I'm sure many of you, if you walk through Old San Juan near La Perla, you've seen this mural along with other murals trying to highlight for the tourists walking through Old San Juan just what the situation is in Puerto Rico. So this particular mural was very explicit about that relationship, that longstanding relationship. So I think for many of us working in this region, we're frequently told that Puerto Rico is somehow, as a case, an exception, or maybe it's exceptional, which for me becomes a shorthand for a space that does not generate theory, but is a space in which theory is meant to act upon. And I think that is extremely problematic. And so when I started writing this piece, this was the sort of first shift I had and thought was, how can Puerto Rico be centered, be seen as a space that is generating theory and not just a space where theory is acting out. And to me, this exceptionalism, this idea of an exceptional case or an exception of space, generates a liminality where certain people, certain regions, certain spaces become, again, avenues through which theories enacted but not created. And I see this in my work at the US-Mexico border as well. That's always seen as an exception, a liminal space where theories never created but just acted out. And my concern has always been, even looking at it from an environmental planning or a disaster planning lens, that this kind of liminality creates all kinds of injustices, as the histories and theories that are endogenous to these spaces basically are relegated with a second-class status, right? That, yeah, you have histories and theories here, that's great, but it doesn't really reflect the broader planning theory, broader planning history. And there are many, many spaces across the world that suffer from this, this sort of liminality. But I think a lot of urban scholars nowadays are really starting to push against these ideas. And in many, many different ways, in many different spaces across the field, they're asking if anything really is liminal. Is anything truly liminal? Are there spaces that are really ever truly at the edge of anything? And in rendering spaces like Puerto Rico liminal, what is really occurring when that's happening? And I think this is why, and this is sort of like kind of obvious to a lot of the people here who study Puerto Rico, but we never refer to the United States as a mainland. To me, that's a term that's historically inscribed Puerto Rico's liminality to the US. And I think argues like a coloniality in the basic terms we use to relate Puerto Rico to the United States. But this issue of liminality is something that a lot of scholars have really tried to understand and negotiate. And so I think of works like Tato Laviera's famous poem, Nire Ki Nire Ja, which really focuses on this idea of being neither here nor there, and putting in tension here, at least in terms of language, the tensions between Spanish and English and the coloniality of both of these languages. But here in the poem, using Spanglish to really highlight those tensions, but also to say that there is a specific new, different, maybe even pre-existing space that that is happening and occurring here, right? That it's not just these two separate things, but we are actually creating a new space. He says here, yet to be defined, evolutionary hybrid, like we're creating our own zone here. So this, it feels maybe a bit like preaching to the choir with this group, but anytime I talk about this piece to a broader audience, I feel like I have to set the stage for why is Puerto Rico so important? Why are the theories that are generated in Puerto Rico broadly applicable? Why should we care? And so in this work, I really try to center the experiences of Puerto Ricans, not viewing them as exceptional or liminal, but actually centering these theories. And especially when we talk about issues of disaster and issues of nature, there are a lot of very interesting new concepts that are emerging that I think help to center these ideas. Specifically, when we're talking about disaster, it's really important to make sure that we're talking about it not in terms of just people's location to relationship to location, relationship to the local environment, but understanding the systems of power that are occurring around them. So one thing that I did in the piece was really talk about this idea of procedural vulnerability, which I think is so key to disaster studies, shifting away from, say, social vulnerability literature, which really tries to place individual characteristics upon each person or each community or each space, but instead understand the systems of power that are cutting across different spaces that interact with your sense of self. And I think that's really sort of at the heart of disaster colonialism, is understanding what are those power relationships that come out of vulnerability that we need to discuss. So just at a base, that's sort of the inspiration for pursuing this idea. Our work began trying to understand issues of procedural vulnerability in Puerto Rico by looking historically at hurricanes that have cut across the region. First, it was a very sort of rote exercise. Here you can see we were just mapping all of the hurricanes that have cut across the archipelago from the time the US began occupying the region up until Hurricanes Irma and Maria. And here you can see all the hurricanes that made landfall in some part of the archipelago. We were also interested in what the intensities and strengths of these hurricanes were. And I should mention these are only the named storms. These are not tropical storms. So we went back and we looked at the intensities of these storms, and we began to pull out specific ones that seemed to figure very prominently in the literature, in the histories of Puerto Rico. And here you can see 6 in particular that stood out to us. But what we saw here, looking back in time, looking back at the histories, the recovery and reconstruction processes after these hurricanes, is that there seems to be a cyclical nature to what was going on. It seemed like each generation had that major hurricane that was really influencing how we think about the archipelago, how we think about disaster, how we understand our relationship to the environment. And this can be seen, you know, in past generations. So for my own family, we would always hear stories about Hurricane San Felipe, which was very terrifying to our family living in Arecibo. The storm almost washed our house out to sea, apparently, and that figured very, very prominently in the memories of our family. And even seeing remnants of that hurricane in, say, this, you know, historic plainus from the time, but understanding how these storms leave deep impressions upon each generation. For our generation, it's Irma and Maria. But just understanding that there are these processes that what we see today is tied to the past, and we have that cultural memory of hurricane. So following this idea of procedural vulnerability, wanted to understand what are the issues that are cropping up after Hurricanes Irma and Maria. One of the things our group did, in addition to looking at those historic disasters, those historic hurricanes, was many of you know that status PR was constantly, you know, in the days after Maria, updating status of all kinds of different infrastructure across the island. We were tracking it because they would update the status each day and they would delete the old days data. And so we were being sneaky, and every day we'd go on and we'd capture the day's information. And that gave us a larger sort of picture of what was happening after Hurricane Irma in particular. And so here, actually tracking that access to electricity and seeing that, you know, even 2 months afterwards, about only half the island or the archipelago had access to electricity. We did the same thing with water. So here you can see access to water was very limited even a month after. And then that was actually even disaggregated in the in status PR by region. And so we can see that in particular, the northern region was having more trouble accessing water. We have this also with cell data, all kinds of other pieces of infrastructure. But what we were seeing is that these trends after Maria, lack of access to basic services, difficulties getting these services back online, mirrored a lot of the discussions, a lot of the issues that we were seeing after many of the other hurricanes we were looking at, like Hurricane Hugo, Hurricane Sensiriaco, all of them. And so the question for us became that these persistent issues that we were seeing and getting basic infrastructure, basic utilities, basic services back online seemed to be sort of this like recalling of past disasters, right? And revisiting these past disasters, we see the same issues just playing out over and over again. That what we saw with Maria is nothing new. It's this constant issue that Puerto Ricans must contend with. Puerto Rico is in the most hurricane-prone region of the Atlantic. We shouldn't be seeing these recurring infrastructural issues. And so the question for us became, why does this happen, or why does this continue to happen in Puerto Rico? And so in trying to understand theoretically how we can frame this question, that's where the idea for understanding this concept of disaster colonialism came from. So to answer this question, we turn to theories used to explain disaster recovery and reconstruction. And particularly after Hurricanes Irma and Maria, one theory really rose to the forefront as a major explanation for why this was happening. And that was, of course, disaster colonialism from Naomi Klein. And disaster colonialism is a critically important concept. I'm definitely not arguing that it should be thrown away or discarded in any way. It's a very important concept that's used to describe how capitalist interests are embedded within disasters, and can even describe capitalism's propensity for trying to create disasters in order to generate profit. And while evidence of disaster colonialism is no doubt present in post-Maria Puerto Rico, there's a larger part of Puerto Rico's experience, I think, that isn't captured under this narrative. That's a narrative that's largely external or exogenous to the archipelago. And so here's just an example. So here are the opportunity zones in Puerto Rico, marked in orange. It's basically the entire space of Puerto Rico. And these opportunity zones were long heralded as a way of trying to develop, quote, underdeveloped parts of the country. And I think a lot of Puerto Ricans, this is a very controversial issue right now, opportunity zones and whether they're useful or not. And I think a lot of people have used opportunity zones as a way of highlighting this issue of disaster capitalism. We're creating an entire space of exceptionalism where we can have all kinds of tax breaks, all kinds of programs that wouldn't be accepted in other places, and allowing capitalism to basically profit off of Puerto Rico's debt and its inability to, enact certain ideas of governance because of PROMESA. And I think this is oftentimes used as a very clear example of disaster capitalism. But what's interesting is I think even looking at opportunity zones, it feels like there's still something about Puerto Rican history, about Puerto Rican culture, about Puerto Rican struggle that's still not being represented, even if we look at something like an opportunity zone and just try and map it onto a disaster capitalist framework. And so I think even in discussing an economic concern like an opportunity zone, there's still something missing from the story if we only apply a disaster capitalist framework. And what's interesting is if you look at the actual book, Battle for Paradise, one of the things I noticed is that it really doesn't extend any discussion of Puerto Rico, its history, its culture, its economic issues past the early part of the 21st century. And I think because of that, because of the fact that it doesn't really go into anything earlier than that, it starts to attribute the issues after Maria and Irma to debt. And I think there's actually a larger discussion here of what's happening. It's not just about Puerto Rican debt. That certainly factors into the issues that Puerto Rico is facing. But I think there's a larger historical context that's being omitted. And so that's where the impetus for disaster colonialism came into play, was this urge to tell the whole story, to see both sides. And so in doing so, I was really influenced by Latin American scholars like Nelson Maldonado Torres and Aníbal Quijano, who really show that throughout the histories of the Caribbean and Latin America, there's been always, since their inceptions, this intricate relationship between capitalism and colonialism. That both of these concepts came to light simultaneously, particularly in the Caribbean. And so if we only focus on issues of capitalism, we're leaving out a whole piece of the discussion. And so that's really what the idea of disaster colonialism tries to understand, is using this idea of procedural vulnerability to focus on power relations. How can we show how colonialism and coloniality operate through disaster. And specifically, I'm interested in not talking about colonialism or coloniality as some kind of disembodied concept like we're going to decolonize academia or something, you know, that's a different beast. We're really talking about it like if you've read Tuck and Yang's piece, decolonization is not a metaphor. That's really kind of the spirit of what we're talking about here. What are specifically mechanisms, policy mechanisms, planning mechanisms, programmatic mechanisms, cultural mechanisms that actually allow this repeatedly poor disaster recovery to occur over history because of the power imbalances caused by colonization. And what's interesting is looking back into the history of Puerto Rico's relationship with environmentalism, we see this argument. It already existed, and that was really compelling to me. So thinking about scholars like Tomas Morales Cardona and Carmen Concepcion, they actually have shown this relationship in a different capacity, a different scale, through the idea of environmental colonialism. And that idea that these early ideas of environmental justice are present in Puerto Rico's history, particularly in the 70s and the 60s. What we see, you know, toxic coal ash dumping today, when we see issues like the lingering environmental issues from the Vieques bombings, or all these kinds of concerns have already been linked by Puerto Rican scholars to issues of colonization and coloniality. We are experiencing these issues, this pollution, these public health concerns because of our colonial status with the US. And so really, disaster colonialism to me is an extension of environmental colonialism. Instead of, you know, just focusing on point sources of pollution, which environmental justice scholarship has traditionally done, can we expand that framework to understand how this could work through disaster, through hurricanes, maybe through earthquakes, like we had to look at earlier last year. And so in looking at the history of Puerto Rico from this lens, what we see is that it's not just the withholding of disaster aid and response that seems to cause these problems of repeatedly poor post-disaster recovery and construction. That's certainly a huge part of it, but there are these other issues as well. And these are just a few that we found in our initial work looking at the historic recovery and reconstruction from other hurricanes. First is this issue of criminalization of Indigenous weather tracking and Indigenous knowledge around hurricanes. So scholars like Stuart Schwartz have shown that the Tainos were very adept at sensing when hurricanes were approaching Puerto Rico. They were able to predict just by looking at the waves and looking at the wind. They're able to predict that a hurricane was coming sometimes 4 days before it would actually make landfall. And under the Spanish, this sort of system of reading the wind and the waters was just seen as witchcraft, and it was actually criminalized in the early days of Puerto Rico. And so that kind of knowledge, understanding early on how the Tainos could not actually warn the Spanish that a hurricane was coming for fear of repercussion. Also, the Spanish were known on multiple occasions to place Black and Taino communities in the path of storms, placing them in the most vulnerable parts of the archipelago as a sort of blockade for their own settlements. And so Schwartz also talks about that in a lot of his work. The second thing that we've seen come up in our historic research is the militarization of weather technology. And this was particularly prominent around the time that the Puerto Rico was given to the US. What we saw was that a lot of weather technologies were being weaponized at the time. So essentially, you know, if the US wanted to have a broad presence in the Caribbean, they had a lot of weather stations, which were also not just monitoring weather, but monitoring other activities at that time. And so a lot of nations like Haiti and Jamaica refused to have these stations in their countries and within their territories. And because of that, the US actually refused to tell them if they could sense a hurricane was coming, and that had disastrous impacts for Haiti, especially at the turn of the 20th century. And so eventually these nations just sort of gave in and said, fine, you can install your technology, but they really didn't want to. And so there are also these kinds of issues at play too. Modern weather technology, how does that factor into ideas of power across the Caribbean? And then lastly, there's also an extensive history of anti-Black and anti-Indigenous messaging that we saw in disaster communications throughout time. And Sarah Molinari's work here has been amazing after Maria to show how that kind of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous messaging has also been present in the US, even through hurricanes like Irma and Maria, signaling basically who is deserving or not deserving of aid after a disaster. And so ultimately, disaster capitalism as a concept not only leads us to identify issues of the withholding and the misuse of post-disaster recovery and reconstruction funds, which is important, but important to talk about, but also allows us to understand how these issues occur more broadly within Puerto Rico. Also, it allows us to look at an idea like disaster capitalism and say, that is, a theory that's been created that's external to Puerto Rico. It may have some applications, but what are the ways of thinking within the archipelago that help us to understand our histories of disaster, particularly our history of hurricanes, and how can we reflect that, and then how we theorize our relationship to these disasters, and even how we understand policies and other issues in relation to disaster. So I'll quickly finish up here because I'd love to give some space for discussion. These were just 3 questions that I posed at the end of my IJER piece that I think are really important to consider. We're considering these questions not just within Puerto Rico, but also more broadly within the US, as other communities in the US have been telling us that they see similar issues taking place after disaster in their communities. So the first question, if not for the disaster, would the phenomena taking place be usefully considered settler colonialism or some other form of colonialism or coloniality? My question for those who do work in disaster planning is, why would a hurricane or an earthquake change the nature of the inequities that we're focusing on? There's a lot of scholarship in disaster studies that shows that disasters simply exacerbate the pre-existing inequalities that are at work in a community. And so for Puerto Rico, that would be issues of coloniality and colonialism. Second, in regions marked by frequent disasters, how might the history of recurring disasters be used to entrench racial violence and dispossession? How can we shift from seeing disasters as events to disasters as constitutive of structural inequalities? And so for me, it's this concern that we need to start merging research and activism on environmental justice and racism with emerging work on disasters. There's this idea that we have these localized issues. If they're constantly being pitted against disaster in any sense, really, how is that actually entrenching the inequities faced by these communities? When will they actually have the time to address the inequities that they're facing? And then lastly, with increasing numbers of disasters due to climate change, how might disaster colonialism develop? And I think this is a question, obviously, for much beyond Puerto Rico, but how do ahistorical views of disasters distort the issues at hand by downplaying the survivance of communities, or worse, centering the issues on the communities themselves? And so looking at the Gulf Coast this fall, seeing how they were hit by so many hurricanes in rapid succession, I worry that what we're seeing there is sort of anti-Blackness and a lot of the planning structures in the Gulf of Mexico being exacerbated and highlighted through this repeated disaster, through those multiple hurricanes that struck. And that's sort of outside of my scope of research, but I've been working with others who are trying to understand how this idea of disaster colonialism might actually be developing in sort of rural Mississippi and rural Louisiana as they try to rebuild after those multiple hurricanes that hit them this fall. So with that, I'll just close with a note from Neil Smith, reminding us that disasters don't simply flatten landscapes, washing them smooth, rather they deepen and erode the ruts of social difference that they encounter. In this case, in our discussions, issues of colonization and how that works through society. So with that, I'll leave it at that for discussion. Yeah, thank you so much.